Good afternoon. Welcome, welcome. Glad to see all of you here on this cold January night. My name is Hank Clark. I'm program coordinator of the Political Economy Project, and it really and truly is a joy and a delight to see all of you here this evening. This is the second public event that the PEP is sponsoring in the winter term. We have at least five more that I'm aware of, 3 in the coming 8 days. Please have a look at our website for more details, or your inbox. We'll have information about each of those events. And for this evening, this particular event is a special event, I would say. It's a third in a unique series, the first that the PEP has ever done, a year-long series of 6 lectures under the grand rubric of Understanding the Economy. Those of you who missed lectures 1 and 2 that Professor Kohn gave in September and early October, you can find the YouTube video of them on our website. And this event will also be recorded, as will the remaining talks as well. And the topic for today's talk, as you noticed, is communism and capitalism. Nothing too serious or important there, just a couple of marginal details, I guess, but I'm sure Professor Kohn will instruct us otherwise. He truly needs no introduction. He's been teaching here at Dartmouth College for a very long time. He knows about as much about the global economic history, East and West, as anyone that I know. And that really is the framework for all of these talks, including the one this evening. So, without any further ado, won't you please join me in welcoming Mayor Kohn.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Hank for all his hard work organizing these lectures, and to the PEP for sponsoring them, and to George Records, who supports the PEP and without whose help we wouldn't be able to do any of these things. Okay, to the talk. I'm going to focus on capitalism and communism as economic systems. Okay, there's a lot of other things to say about them, which I won't be talking about in the bulk of the talk. At the end, I will make some comments about some of those things, and I think by then you'll understand how they differ as economic systems, and it will make those things easier to talk about. Okay. First of all, the standard story for what they are and what the difference is. The standard story is that both of them are fairly recent economic systems. Capitalism replaced feudalism, an older system in the 19th century, something to do with the Industrial Revolution. And communism appeared in Russia in 1917 and spread to other countries, particularly China. Okay, sometimes Russia spread them to other countries, but spread the system. What they are and how they differ, according to the conventional story: capitalism, private ownership and control of production, prices determined in free markets. Under communism, state ownership and control of production, prices set by the state. The consequence, why this matters: capitalism, the market prices result in the best allocation of resources and so the most productive economy. Communism, state plans production and distribution, inferior allocation, less productive economy. That's sort of the standard story.
I'm just trying to get the volume up. Yeah.
Oh.
We might have trouble hearing you there.
Oh, this isn't feeding into a microphone. This is just for the recording.
Oh, okay, all right.
Are you having trouble hearing me?
I think they're having trouble hearing.
Oh, okay. What can we do? I could speak louder. Yeah, that's. I speak pretty loud. No, I don't want to stand over there. So yeah, just forget about it.
Does this work?
You could wear a separate mic that's feeding into the house system too, if that
I think that would be great. If we could feed it, then everyone would be able to hear. Sorry to interfere.
No, that's helpful.
Thank you.
Sorry to double mic if you just want
That's
to
okay.
put that on.
I have one in each pocket. Okay, can you hear me better now? No?
It's
Is it-
definitely better. Let's try the mic. It'll get better.
Okay?
Oh.
All right, sorry about that. I have to actually tone my voice down now. All right, so I will argue that neither of these systems is recent. What we call capitalism and communism both are examples of economic systems that go back thousands of years, not new. The description of what they are and how they differ is true as far as it goes, but misses the key distinction and the most important consequences. Okay? So let me start with my own work from which I derive my understanding of this issue. For some years, I've been studying economic and political history to understand the process of economic progress, economic development and growth. And my focus has been on pre-industrial Europe and pre-industrial China, but I've also looked at earlier periods a bit, and I'm familiar with later periods. So I've looked at a lot of economic and political history. So I just want to give you the elevator version of what I found from doing this, and then I'll come back to the topic. So the first thing that I find is economic activity is not just production, which is what economists tend to think about. There are also two other economic activities that are extremely important. One of them is commerce, and the other one is predation. Okay, predation sounds bad. It shouldn't happen. It's immoral. But a lot of people make their living from predation. Okay, you're looking at me like I'm crazy. The Chinese Communist Party, for example, is a good example. Is a good example of that. Okay, we'll have more to say about that as we go. So these two activities were introduced in the first two lectures. The first one on finance. Finance is a branch of commerce, and the second one was the predation trap, which obviously talks about predation. To understand economic progress, need to understand how these three activities interact with each other. Okay, so commerce interacts with production in a process of economic evolution that generates economic progress. That's where economic progress comes from. The process is self-perpetuating. It needs nothing else, no external cause or anything like that. It runs itself and it keeps going, okay? If you look, therefore, why isn't everyone rich, okay? And the answer is the pace of economic progress isn't determined by causes, it's determined by obstacles. And now we come to predation. That's the predation trap. Okay, predation is the obstacle that holds back economic progress. So the predation trap process is, and it's not a new idea, this was sort of a big thing in the late 18th century. A lot of philosophers are talking about this. So as the economy gets richer, it creates new opportunities for predation. And people take those opportunities, predation increases, and it chokes back economic progress. That's the predation trap. The economy, and in particular commerce, find ways of dealing with this, getting around this predation and carrying on business. Okay, so things pick up again until the next cycle. One important cycle, which actually we need for what I'm going to be talking about, is the origins of government. So government is very closely related to predation, okay? And the first government emerged with sedentary agriculture when organized groups of armed men could take over and control a population and collect tribute from them, okay? With hunter-gatherers, you couldn't do that. They wouldn't stay there. They would move on. They would go somewhere else. With sedentary agriculture, it's difficult to do. This happened in particular, there's a very nice paper on this, in areas that were constrained, either by desert or by mountains. So it's not a coincidence that ancient Egypt, that predatory government was in the Nile Valley. If you've ever been there, you can look wherever you are in the Nile Valley, you look to each side, you can see the desert. Okay, it's not far away, and there's a lot of it. So that's predatory governments emerged in this way. We come to the second part of the predation trap. How did commerce deal with this threat? What it did essentially was set up its own government. And in particular, commercial cities were wealthy enough, large enough, not by today's standards, but relatively large, wealthy enough, they could afford to set up their own defense, and they established governments to be in charge of that, to collect the revenue and organize the forces and do all this sort of thing. I call that associational government, but you could also call it commercial government, okay? Predatory government is imposed on a population from above. You don't get to vote on this. If you don't like it, they'll kill you. Associational government is organized from below, okay, and is supposedly, it doesn't always work very well, answerable to the population, okay? That's the distinction. In the study of economic and political history, coming back to our topic, I found only 3 economic systems. Okay, in all of history, you know, everything that I saw, there were really 3 distinct economic systems, and they differed in the relative importance of the 3 economic activities. Okay, so you have to have production, or you don't eat. Okay, so production is essential. There are no systems without production, but the other 2 activities can vary. Okay, so if you have only production, you have one type of economy. It's called a subsistence economy. Okay, and I'll talk more detail about all of these 3 types because it's essential to what I'm to the point of the talk. If you have production and predation, we just talked about that, you have what is called a tribute economy. Okay, and the third kind, if you have commerce and production, you have a commercial economy. Okay, and let's look at each of those in turn. Okay, so a subsistence economy, households produce mainly for their own consumption, subsistence. There's some local exchange within a community. There is people specialize somewhat, doing different things and exchange with each other. But there's no commerce, so there's no long distance exchange. You're not trading with people beyond your village or, you know, the few villages near you. That's sort of the limit. All exchange is local and direct. There may be some petty predation, but no organized predation, by assumption, okay? Examples, hunter-gatherers, pastoral tribes, and some arable agriculture, which may not be worth the effort of the organized armed groups, okay? I know, there's a good book on that, but I don't have time to talk about that, okay? So we'll bring in Adam Smith. I have a call out our expert on Adam Smith. The source of productivity of human societies, according to Smith, is the social organization of production. Okay, that's what increases productivity. It enables division of labor, specialization, and the adoption of technology, all the things that increase productivity. In addition, the potential productivity grows with the scale of social organization. The larger the number of producers in, you know, that are part of this social organization, the more opportunities there are to increase production. Okay, and in a subsistence economy, which is what we're talking about, the scale of social organization is very small. So there's not a lot of gains from that, and productivity is very low, incomes at subsistence level, okay? A last word on this, if there's a sort of a movement, a motto, buy local. If you take that seriously, you would be in a subsistence economy. Okay, you'd be very, very poor if people did that. All right. Let's go on to a tribute economy, which we already sort of looked at. So you take subsistence and you add organized predation. Not just, random people stealing things and, this kind of thing, but an organization devoted to predation on the population, collecting tribute. And the kind of tribute that it collects is generally in kind. Okay, these are not usually monetary economies. And they take the form, two things that are very popular. I'm familiar with China, where but in Europe it wasn't that different. Grain is popular. That's sort of the basic product of sort of societies at this level. Cloth is often a thing. And very important, in addition to that, is what is called corvée labor, okay, which is call it conscripted labor. Okay, so part of your tribute is you have to work for the ruler a certain number of days or weeks or months of the year. Okay, so for example, when on Passover the Jews talk about we were slaves in Egypt, not really. We were corvée laborers in Egypt. I don't think this was a full-time thing. But it was still not a pleasure. Okay, those pyramids were really tricky. So production in a tribute economy. So tribute is in those forms, and you have a command economy in that the government tells people what to produce for tribute. Okay, so they tell you what grain they want, they tell you what cloth they want, they tell you when they want you to show up, and then they give you orders about what to do. Okay. The most notable historical example, the most sophisticated example of the tribute economy was under the Chinese tribute, what I call the tribute state, okay, that began with the first Qin emperor in 221 BC, the Qin Shi Huangdi, okay, yeah. They still have the same system, you'll be pleased to hear. It hasn't changed, okay? It's changed names, but it's basically the same system. So in a tribute economy, production is primarily for tribute and subsistence. There's some local exchange, but little commerce. In the Chinese tribute state, commerce was not just absent, it was suppressed. Okay? The tribute economy can still be much more productive than subsistence. Why? No volunteers? The scale of social organization is much greater. It's not very efficient, not done very well, but there's potential there. Okay? So for example, you have large-scale projects like the Great Wall, the pyramids. You have large-scale industrial production. That you have, you bring a lot of laborers to the capital, and you set up sort of factories where they produce. Because of the greater scale, this form of social organization is much more productive than subsistence. It's a big, in terms of productivity, not in other ways maybe, but in terms of productivity, it's sort of a big step up. Other examples of tribute economy. So feudalism is an example of a tribute economy. It was decentralized, pretty crude, no large-scale organization, not very productive, okay? Marco Polo from feudal Europe went to China, was very impressed with what he saw there. Okay, so we'll see that the feudal economy actually had one big advantage. It didn't prohibit commerce. Okay, things changed. And the relative wealth of Europe and China switched. What's another example of a tribute economy? No. Communism, that we're here to discuss. Communism is an example of a tribute economy. As an economic system, it's a tribute economy. And in particular, in China, although it's regarded by some as an import from the Soviet Union, it was in fact just a return to the classical tribute state. Historically, China had had interruptions in the tribute state. It broke down, commerce came in, things were really good, and then it was reestablished and we went back. Sort of early 20th century was when it was sort of all broken up and commerce was doing reasonably well. Mao reestablished control and recreated essentially the classical tribute state. I had this conversation with a Chinese student a while ago, and I told him I haven't really studied the modern period that well. It's just what I read in the papers kind of thing. But Mao looks a lot like the first Ming emperor, did a lot of the same thing. The first Ming emperor didn't like cities, and he took people from the cities and sent them for re-education to the countryside. Does that sound familiar? And the Chinese student said to me, duh, everyone knows that the first Ming emperor was Mao's big hero. It wasn't a coincidence. He really admired the guy. So the Chinese communism is really just a reincarnation of the tribute state and the tribute economy, okay? Okay, so that's the tribute economy. The third is the commercial economy. So what commerce does for a living, okay, that's how it makes money, is it lowers trading costs, okay? And we saw that with finance, those of you who were at the first lecture. That's an example. So exchange is no longer, if you have commerce, exchange is no longer limited to local exchange. Okay? You can have long distance exchange. And the results are expansion of the market, a larger scale of social organization, and much higher productivity. Okay? Production in a commercial economy is mostly for sale. Okay? People meet their own needs by buying stuff in the market. Okay? They specialize because they tend to do what brings them the most income, that they can buy the most stuff. Okay, so you pick the thing you're good at and you do that, and then you use the money to buy what you need. If it's a commercialized tribute economy, like in late feudalism, it's still feudal, but because commerce was working, it had become quite largely commercialized. Tribute in kind was replaced by money taxes. And that's a big step forward. Because then you get to produce what is really productive and just pay what you owe in money. That's itself an improvement. So examples of early commercial economies: ancient Eastern Mediterranean, Levant, Greece, and the early Roman Empire. Okay? They were all commercial economies to a considerable extent. What commerce does, it transforms subsistence economies into commercial economies. Okay, that's what commerce does. And what's another name? And this is called commercialization, commercializes them. Another name for commercialization, any suggestions? More commonly known as economic development. That is economic development. And again, I'm far from being the first to say that. Okay, it's the creation of a market economy. Okay, that's economic development. Then you go on from there, but that's the first step. So commerce can also transform a tribute economy into commercial economy. I mentioned that happened in feudal Europe. It was gradually commercialized. By the 19th century, this was largely complete in several regions or countries in Europe were fully commercialized. That's as good as it gets. Another name for a commercial economy is, no volunteers? Capitalism, thank you. It was begging to be said, okay, capitalism. So what is called capitalism is in fact a commercial economy. How did the commercial economy get the name capitalism? And it's kind of interesting. Okay, I'm attributing it to Marx. I don't know if that's true. Was that true? You don't know either. Okay, let's say it's blame. Yeah, let's blame Marx for this. Okay. Anyhow, 19th century. Okay, it was 19th century after the Industrial Revolution, and writers such as Marx saw rich economies, and what seemed to characterize them was factories. Okay, capital. Okay, so this is what, and but they mistook cause and effect. Okay, they thought that the countries were rich because they had factories. And they had factories because they were rich, because they were commercial economies, and this was the next stage of development of commercial economies, was industrialization. We're after that stage now. We're post-industrial. Okay, it's described. I'll talk a little bit about that. But so the factories were not the cause, they were just an effect. Okay, so the correlation was kind of bogus in a sense. I mean, there was a correlation, but the causality was the opposite of what Marx and others thought. So lots of capital, you have capitalism. So the Industrial Revolution in particular did not change the economic system. It was a commercial economy before, and it was a commercial economy after. No big change, not a new system. It changed, there was some change in the nature of capital. Okay, there was a lot more fixed capital, factories, okay, buildings and machinery. Recently, the nature of capital has changed again. Okay, if you look at the richest economies, not factories that characterize them. You find factories all over the place. What characterizes them is intangible capital. It's Silicon Valley. It's investment in R&D and organization and knowledge and all this kind of thing, right? So intangible capital is today the big thing. Statistics haven't caught up with that. I mentioned this in Economics 26 for any of you who've suffered through Economics 26. But it's an important change, okay, where it's not factories anymore. So a lot of the worry about losing factories that's yesterday's stuff. Okay, today's stuff is different. So as I said, today is called post-industrial economy. Again, no change in the economic system. Okay, it was commercial economy before, it's commercial economy still. Okay, no change. So it's just, again, another new stage in its evolution. What is the effect of this confusion on communist economies and economic development? So the communists believed this story, okay, that factories are the key to wealth, and they built lots of factories. How did that turn out? Not a big success. It sort of reminds me, there's something called a cargo cult. Anyone familiar with the term? In World War II, American forces were on various islands, and they built runways so that planes could bring in supplies for them. So the native population saw this and thought, oh, building a runway, okay, that's a good idea. So when the Americans left, they also built runways, waiting for the planes to come with the supplies. It's easy to mistake what's going on. Anyhow, the idea of a cargo cult is that's what this is called. Yeah, early development economics was the same mistake. If you looked at development economics in the early 50s, a lot of economists thought that it meant industrialization. Development meant industrialization. It doesn't. And artificially building factories won't do you any good. What you need is commercialization of your economy, and the factories will come by themselves. Okay, so if the government builds factories, it will get you nothing. All right, so what is the important difference between capitalism and communism? The presence or absence of commerce. Okay? What are the consequences of the presence or absence of commerce? In a commercial economy, the interaction between commerce and production generates economic progress. In a command economy with commerce suppressed, no economic progress. Instead, you get stagnation. So it's fairly typical that you start with a really sort of primitive, not necessarily subsistence, that's economy. Comes communist, they build factories. There's a sort of jump in productivity compared to what there was before. But that's it, it's over. You don't get anything more. Okay, it doesn't continue to develop and grow. And what's missing, of course, is commerce. Commerce is the thing that produces the dynamics, okay? Okay. For example, yeah, we mentioned for Marco Polo, the Chinese tribute economy was much more impressive than feudal Europe. But in Europe, commerce was allowed to flourish. It transformed the feudal economy and overtook China. And economic historians call that the Great Divergence. Okay, that was commerce did that. Okay, China, they didn't have it. Europe, they did. Okay. So the interaction between commerce and production is also necessary for the economy to adapt to changing needs. Command economies can't do that. Okay? Communism can't do that. We had here talking at the PEP a historian of the Soviet economy, Mark Harrison, a few years ago. And he said that the Soviet economy was a permanent war economy. Okay? And the reason was they knew that if there was a war, they just couldn't reorganize the economy to produce what they needed. They had to be ready. China, I'm not that familiar, but I assume is pretty much the same thing. Okay. In contrast, there's actually a wonderful book by Arthur Herman called Freedom's Forge about how the US economy transformed itself to produce armaments at the beginning of World War II. Okay, and Roosevelt, I'm not a big fan, but he understood this. Okay, if he wanted this to work, he didn't have the government organize this. He got together some leading industrialists and said, look, we need weapons, get to it. Didn't tell them what to do or how to do it. And by the end of World War II, I'm making up the numbers, so I don't remember, they were producing something like 2/3 of the arms for the Allied cause. Okay, not just for the United States, but for other countries, for the Soviet Union too. So if you have a commercial economy, you can adapt. Okay, what does that bring to mind? It's not in my notes. Climate change. Yeah, you can adapt to climate change as well. All right, to sum up, neither capitalism nor communism is new. Capitalism, a commercial economy, and communism, a tribute economy, existed in the ancient world, okay? And they've continued to exist ever since, with variations, but still the same basic structure. The key difference is the presence or absence of commerce, okay? The economic consequences of absence, the crucial failing of communism is not inefficiency, as economists will tell you, inefficient allocation of resources. That's probably true, but that's, that's nothing. That's not really very important. The crucial failing is lack of dynamics. Okay? Without commerce, there are no dynamics, which means stagnation of the economy and an inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Okay. I'll come now to some non-economic differences, which I haven't talked about at all. It's a big subject, but I'll just touch on a few things. So capitalism, the commercial economy, is the result of evolution. It's what happens if you let it. No one plans it, no one invented it. It's beyond, the capabilities of someone to invent. It just happens naturally. And as Smith said, it's a, Smith again, Smith said it was the natural outcome of the human propensity for exchange, to truck and barter. So people evolved this propensity to exchange, and this led inexorably to the commercial economy, if you let it, okay? First of all, people were exchanging, and then people got the idea, you know, I could make a pretty good living just reducing the costs of exchange and helping people to trade with further away and all this kind of thing. And commerce emerged as a specialization, okay? So it's what evolves if allowed and if not blocked by predation. Communism, the tribute economy, is a human construction. It's not natural, it's not evolved. The tribute economy, communism, is imposed by force as a predatory government's instrument of predation. That's, yeah. No population ever volunteered for this. It's always imposed by a predatory government as an instrument of predation. Okay, so that's my talk. I want to take just 1 minute to connect it with the series, okay? So the title of the series is Understanding the Economy. And as this kind of illustrates, it's not just or even mainly standard economics, okay? As you can see, I'm quite critical of standard economics. And not so much that it gets things wrong, which it does sometimes, but it's not mostly that it's wrong. It's mostly that it leaves out a lot of stuff that's important, which you need to understanding the economy. To understand the economy, you need to bring that stuff into the story. In particular, standard economics ignores commerce and predation as economic activities. You don't hear about it. In economics, the market is very important. What is the market? It's a disembodied spirit. Thank you. The market is commerce, okay? It's an economic activity that employs more people than production in the United States today, okay? So, but we don't talk about that. That's just the market. Just gives us prices. That's sort of what matters. And economics talks about government, but this is another disembodied spirit. I call it the fairy godmother theory of government. Okay, if you have a problem, this fairy godmother will come and fix it for you. Okay. Again, not empirically accurate. So this lecture, and those were in lectures 1 and 2. Okay, lecture 1 was about commerce, finance in particular. Lecture 2 was about predation and the predation trap. This lecture uses the same, commerce and predation are important here too, but we bring in something else, okay? That you need to look at the economy not, as economists do, as an equilibrium in static terms, but as a process, okay? And in the remaining lectures, we'll see that this has important benefits for talking about lots of other things as well, okay? The next lecture on February 13th is there is no such thing as market failure. So all of these things that are missing will play a big role in explaining what's wrong with that concept. Okay? All right, Hank, we have some.
Question for Professor Kohn?
So, okay.
Fascinating lecture. Where do you put China today, where you have some market, if I'm not mistaken,
Yes.
elements of capitalism,
Right.
and communist government, which still engage?
It's still controlling, and it has trouble letting go, which is what you would expect from a predatory government.
Kind of like hybrid.
So it happened before. For example, in the late Tang dynasty, there was the empire kind of broke up. There was sort of an attempted coup and a civil war, and it was fragmented, and which was wonderful. The economy thrived. Commerce really took off. The economy thrived. Eventually, the Sung reunited the empire, okay? But unlike what you would expect, they said, wait a minute, there's a lot of money here, there's a lot of resources, let's not spoil this, okay? So they let it continue. They actually even encouraged commerce in some ways, okay, for a period. And then they ran into other problems and that broke down. It's a long story, and we get back to the Ming reestablishing. They didn't, they just went back to the classical tribute state. And Deng Xiaoping was the same thing, okay? It's, you know, the story is that he liberalized the economy, and that's why, no. What happened was the Cultural Revolution. Government was absent. It was busy for a period of years. Commerce popped up, mainly in the villages, and spread to the cities. And the economy liberalized itself. And when Mao died and Deng took over, it was like the Sung again. He said, oh, this is good. We don't want to spoil this, okay? There's a lot of revenue here. So they decided to let it continue. But they couldn't leave it alone. And when Xi comes in, for him, control is the most important thing. And you just can't have these people going around starting companies. The whole idea of venture capital was anathema to him. So they've been a big handicap, and the Chinese economy hasn't overcome that handicap. I don't know if it can. That's the story. So again, this is standard Chinese history, what's happened, or one version of it. Yeah.
Well, just building on Sergei's question, it sounds like actual regimes are some sort of mix.
Oh yeah. No, these are pure types.
Elements of commerce.
So Europe for a long time was a mix of the feudal tribute economy and the commercial economy. But for example, the feudal lords decided they could do much better by joining the commercial economy than by collecting tribute. Okay, so they liberated the serfs, and they they collected rent instead of tribute. And the serfs, now working for themselves, were way more productive, and they got way more in rent than they'd ever earned in tribute. So they became landowners, landholders. Okay, before they were the rulers, the sovereign over the land. Okay, now they gave that up in exchange for a nice economic reward. Yes.
Just a historic example from the Soviet Union
Yes.
as to how communists appeal to capitalism when
Everything else fails. Yeah.
After the revolution, there
Yeah.
was
Oh, right.
we were starving, nothing
Right.
more. So they announced new economic policy.
Right.
And it started to
Right.
thrive, and then they decided to put in jail the most successful. It's a different story.
It's very hard, for them to keep it up. Yes. Yes.
I don't understand whether it would be like the real economy because they're like forcing all of the laborers to produce.
Right.
But at the same time, they're doing that so it's how they can export everything.
Yes.
So is that also a mix?
Oh, absolutely. He needed that. He needed that agricultural output to get the machinery he needed for his factories, right? So they were starving.
Yes.
They were producing food and starving. Okay, Ukraine is sort of the big example of that. Yeah. So, yeah. Questions from further back? Yes.
How would the United States, I feel like sometimes it's mixed when the government's
Oh,
pushing certain policies.
yeah, no, there are the only pure commercial economies, Singapore and Hong Kong were good examples, but Europe, no. So, and the other thing is most commercial economies, real commercial economies, are under associational governments, commercial governments. They have commercial government as well as a commercial economy. And commercial government tends to degenerate to become predatory. Okay, because as it gets bigger in particular, as it gets bigger, it's harder and harder for the population to control the government. Okay, there are diseconomies of scale, if you like. And that then becomes an obstacle to the economy and all this kind of, so it's complicated. We're talking about pure types, getting the basic ideas, And looking at real cases, they're clearly going to be more complicated, I think. No one would deny that. Yeah. Any questions? Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, kind of on like a similar note, I thought the classification of the Soviet economy as a wartime economy had me thinking a lot about like the amount of like Defense Department spending on like military contracts within the U.S. And you mentioned like the transition during like the New Deal under Roosevelt and all that like Keynesian militarism, but how much of that has stayed? Do you believe that's the result of like over investment from the U.S. government?
I don't think that's our problem at the moment. It's the opposite. I mean, what typically happens in the U.S. is between wars, that all kind of disappears. Okay, and between World War I and World War II, not much was left. The military was very small. Military industry was almost non-existent. But the thing was, they could make it happen really quickly. Okay, and something like that might not be a bad idea today. Okay, we're actually pretty weak militarily. Yeah. Yes.
What's your definition of a good government? Perhaps a commercial government, not
Okay. A good government is there's a book with a terrific title. I haven't actually read the book, but I bought it because I just loved the title. And it's a book on economic development, and the title of the book is Just Get Out of the Way. Okay? So the only thing that you need the government to do is this one thing that the commercial economy can't do for itself. That's why it created commercial government. It needs national security. It needs to organize its own defense. So commerce itself organized a form of government for that purpose. Government definitely needs to do that. Doesn't need to do anything with the economy. Zero zip. Okay, ask Elon Musk. Yes.
So I guess in that view, when the government does nothing, you have events like the Great Depression, I would assume.
The government created the Great Depression. You don't have it isn't that you need the government to deal with the Great Depression, which just happened by chance. This was all a result of government policies. You should ask Doug Irwin about this. He's our local expert on the Great Depression. But basically, it was monetary policy, failure to devalue. There was a shortage of gold, okay, because certain governments were hoarding gold. France in particular, the US a little bit, but France a lot. As gold went out of the world monetary system, prices should have gone down. Okay, they should have, right? Because deflation. Okay, and the way you deal with that, okay, or avoid it, is by devaluing the currency. And which is what Roosevelt eventually did after he tried everything else, and that pretty much took care of the problem. But it was a problem that was created by governments. Financial crisis, another example. Okay, I teach financial institutions and markets, and the last class is a lecture by me on the financial crisis of 2008. And it's the only lecture I give, actually. The rest isn't lectures. And the theme is, it was all a result of government interference in the financial system. And there's, again, a very good book on this by Calomiris and Haber called Fragile by Design. And they looked across countries, compared countries. Okay, what is the relationship between government intervention in the financial system and the stability of the financial system? You'd see the more they intervene, the more stable it will be, right? They find the opposite. That the more governments intervene in their financial system, the more financial crises they have. And we are not at the top of the list for crises. Ahead of us is the Democratic Republic of Congo. But that's the only one who's ahead of us. And in particular, they sort of compare the US with Canada. Very similar economies, speaking similar languages. The Canadian government historically has done very little intervention in the financial system. None of the things that the US government has done. In the last, I make up the numbers, I don't remember exactly, but the last 150 years, the US has had 12 major financial crises. Okay, you probably haven't heard of a lot of them because they were some time ago, but big financial crises. In the same period, Canada has 0, not 1. Okay, it was hurt by the financial crisis in the United States, obviously, because we're a big trading partner, but of their own, they haven't had any financial crisis. Yes, at the back.
Yeah, so I mean, if the answer is as simple as government intervention, what drives the desire for governments to intervene?
Oh, two things. First of all, governments want to intervene because they want to increase their power, because they enjoy the benefits of power. That's human nature, not surprising. And the other is sort of in a modern form of government that we have with democracy, you get elected by providing interest groups with what they want. And they contribute to your election and get out the vote and all this kind of thing. So it's all about power and the use of power. There's a good book by Robert Higgs, Crisis and Leviathan, which argues that the US government, which was very small initially, the federal government, every crisis it's grown because we need more powers to deal with the crisis. Okay, and they get more powers and they don't give them back after the crisis is over. And then we go to the next crisis. Oh, we need more powers to deal with the crisis. So the federal government has constantly grown over the decades in its scope and in its how much taxes it takes and so on. So, yeah. Sergey, sorry.
What do you say to the critics? I'm not one of them, but from the left,
Yes.
saying, yes, commerce produces wealth,
Yeah.
but the wealth is distributed unequally. So
Yes.
you have poor people, rich people. And so you need government to redistribute the wealth somehow and sort of create social justice. This is what
Good luck.
democratic
Good luck with that.
socialism,
Yes.
we don't need
Well, I've been there and done that. I have a talk on how I became a libertarian, and the first part is my experience as a socialist on a kibbutz in Israel. Okay, so I'm familiar with those things. But if you ask where are people better off, poor people as well as rich people, it's in countries where the government does the least intervention in the economy. Okay, the intervention net does not make them better off; it makes them worse off. Okay, yes, you can get handouts from the government, but it's hard to find a decent job because of all the regulations and things like that. And money is not a substitute for doing something that gives you, meaning in your life. That becomes much, much harder. So redistribution isn't, the problem. And it's not, most people don't care about that. The people that care about inequality are people like us, so pretty high up in the income distribution, and we resent the people who are even higher up. Okay, the poor people don't compare themselves to Elon Musk. They would just like to do a bit better, and they'd like their kids to do a bit better. And all of this government intervention makes that impossible. So it's not an issue. It's an issue for intellectuals, not for the people. Yes?
Would you say that predation can also derive from sources that are not from the government? Say monopoly.
I'm not hearing you.
Sorry. How would you respond to the idea of predation as a fluid category that isn't always under the auspices of the government, but could also be?
Oh no, the mafia is predation. There's lots of private predation. And the mafia, in fact, is kind of a private government in many ways. It started off in Sicily where the government was pretty deficient, and they took on a lot of the roles of the government. So that's the source. So there is private predation as well. But in terms of the economy, it doesn't matter as much as government predation. And it's much easier for people, commerce, to deal with private predation. Okay, even police is a fairly recent thing. Okay, people in the Middle Ages and later than that went around armed. That was a big help to protect themselves. Okay, ships had big crews which could fight, or cannon to protect themselves. So private predation is a problem, and it does occur, but it's not the same scale of problem as government predation. Okay.
Time for one more question, perhaps?
Haven't we answered all the questions by now? Yes.
I was just wondering, do you think it's even possible for the U.S. to go to a true...
I'm not hearing you. Can you
Is it
stand up?
possible for the U.S. to go towards a true commercial economy at this point, given how inextricably...
Who knows?
Okay.
I mean, who knows? One hopes. You
Okay.
hear good noises from the incoming administration, but we have to wait and see. I don't know.
Thanks very much, Mayor Kohn.